At this point in the story of the church's history, we are really on the verge of moving from the period of late antiquity on into the period of the early Middle Ages. Now, these periods of time, these differentiations, are really the product of historians trying to compartmentalize and notice changes over time, not only in an effort to remember it, to understand these shifts in time and their importance, but also when you move from one era to another, it signals changes in the culture at large. Well, at this point in the story, we have come quite a long ways from the ancient church, just after the apostles with the apostolic fathers, on through the period of the times of persecution, with the early fights on Trinity and Christology, up to the conversion of Constantine, and then the era of the Nicene and Constantinople creeds. Well, one of the things that's helpful for students is to just notice whenever there is sort of a pregnant moment in history, whenever you see the development of serious voices all coming onto the scene at once. The Reformation is one of these periods where it seems that a significant number of folks, both in the Renaissance and in the Protestant world, were some of the leading shapers of Western history ever. Well, there's one of these moments here in the church's history as well. Not everyone realizes it, but when you get to the late 4th and early 5th centuries, there is almost an eruption of theological thinking and writing and reflection that creates, particularly for the West, this frenzied engagement with the scriptures and with all of the theological thinking that had gone before. I mean, just look at some of these names that are born almost within the same generation. Ambrose, born in 340. Jerome, 347. Chrysostom, also 347. Gregory Nazianzus, one of the Cappadocians who we saw in our lectures on the Nicene and Constantinople creeds, was born in 329. Basil the Great, 330, as well as several others. Well, these names on this list form part of the list of the doctors of the church. Now, in Catholic history and in Catholic practice, a doctor of the church is someone who's given this honorific or this title as a way of saying that their theology, their writing, is synonymous, you might say, with Catholic teaching in general. Now, it doesn't mean that it rises to the rank of papal proclamation, but it does mean that all Catholics are, in a way, engaging with their thinking. From the Protestant perspective, it's more of honoring the significant changes in writing and deep reflection on Scripture that these men provide to the church in the West. In both the West and the East, but increasingly, since many of these men are Latin speakers, it's the West that sees these great figures as part of their heritage. Well, by far, the most significant figure from this generation, from this period of frenzied activity, is Augustine. Really, you can't be hyperbolic about the influence and the importance of Augustine. Augustine is a man astride two periods of time. In fact, in many ways, Augustine almost embodies the change from the late antiquity period to the early medieval period. His writings sort of usher in all that would come after it. He's a bit like Luther in that way. Luther stood astride the medieval and the modern world. Well, Augustine stood astride the late antiquity or the ancient world and the early medieval world. Augustine's works are some of the most important works of all of church history, in fact. Again, it wouldn't be hyperbolic to say that outside of the New Testament, no single figure more shaped the Christian worldview or the theology of the entirety of everyone who came after him than Augustine. We can just look, for example, at some of the things that he affected. First and foremost is the Confessions. The Confessions is really at the top of just about everyone's bucket list of books to read before they die. The Confessions themselves actually usher in an entirely new genre of literature. Today, if someone were to write a biography of themselves, a celebrity or a politician or someone of note, it's just taken as axiomatic that what they are supposed to do in their autobiography is sort of bare their soul, talk about their formation, talk about their challenges, talk about their ups and their downs, and how, at the end, all of this grand narrative of their life culminated in some great moment. Well, students need to realize that type of writing, that formation of a confession, of telling one's life journey, one's spiritual journey, didn't really exist before Augustine. There were biographies, to be sure. Pagans in particular, Romans, loved to write biographies of themselves, or at least have them written about them. Well, most of these really are just the exploits, the kind of thumping of the chest of all the conquering that they've done along the way of their life. You will not find a pagan bearing his soul about his childhood, for example. But then along comes Augustine's Confessions. And it is a marvel. Most people, when they read it today, can find it a bit ho-hum because they're so used to this type of genre. But when Augustine first published it, it had never been done before. Nothing had been seen like it. What about doctrinal issues? Just take the issues of grace, justification, predestination, and works. There is not a single person who has discussed any of these issues after Augustine that has not, in some ways, whether they know it or not, discussed these issues in the vocabulary and the context and the framework that Augustine gives us. And we'll look at that framework in the second lecture on Augustine that we're going to be doing. But Augustine against the Pelagians is profoundly important for shaping how the West and the Latin world will talk about original sin and free will. In terms of church life, church practice, Augustine shaped, again, the vocabulary of the sacraments, how he even approached the language of talking about the sign or the symbol, the bread and the wine, and the thing that it signifies. Church allegiance, church authority. Augustine is one of the great thinkers on ecclesiology, we say. He wrote against the Donatists, who were schismatic, and Augustine's arguments about pastoral ministry and about dealing with sin and living with the sin of the church and the wheat and the tares, again, is profoundly important in shaping not only Catholic but Protestant history. Things like Christ and culture, just war theory, for example, is profoundly important for Augustine. He makes one of the first arguments, actually, that there can be a justified ethical war, or that Christians can serve in the military, for example. These issues, just war theory, and Augustine's concepts of this, are discussed all the way down until today, all the way into the 21st century. Augustine's theory of the just war is one of the most important touchstones for people thinking about war and combat and violence today. And the list could actually go on and on. So as we begin looking at Augustine, we have to really appreciate who he is and how he shapes the church in the West. And we can begin by looking at the context of who Augustine is, because in this lecture, we're going to be looking at his life. We're going to trace the contours of how he went from a little boy in North Africa all the way to being a bishop and a churchman. But I find that for students and newcomers to this material, and even frankly people who have become very familiar with it, what's often overlooked is the context of where Augustine is, both in terms of the Roman world and in terms of the world that he comes from in North Africa. First and foremost, Augustine is a North African. A recent biography of Augustine actually points out a letter in which Augustine, towards the end of his life, says very boldly that he is an African writing for Africans, and it's something that he was very proud of. Augustine would have referred to himself as a Punic, which refers back to the Roman Empire and its Punic Wars, which was a series of wars between Rome and North Africa. Augustine saw himself as African. But what's missed in this too often is that as we trace the story of Augustine, the great pagan who converts and becomes a churchman and a theologian, too often it is assumed that North Africa is some kind of bastion of old world paganism. Actually, it's the opposite. North Africa is a bit like the Bible Belt. African Christianity was entirely punchy and full-throated and muscular. It took itself seriously. It already had taken on cultural characteristics that, again, mimic something like the Bible Belt. I mean, just remember, this is the area of Donatism. This is the area in which people had left the church because they felt like it wasn't morally righteous enough in order to gain their allegiance. Now, not everyone there is Christian, obviously. There are plenty of pagans still in North Africa. But as we'll see as we go through the story, Augustine really is a man who has left the cradle of his early childhood, which was shaped by Christian faith, from his mother in particular. And he's gone off to the big city, to the big show, in the dens of iniquity of Rome and Milan. But if you miss this point, then you really miss the tortured anxiety that Augustine exhibits, particularly in his youthful days. He has the kind of guilt of someone who grew up in a Christian world with Christian influence. who felt some pangs of wanting to be a part of that world, but his intellectual pursuits and his carnal recreational activities, let's say, kind of clouded his judgment, clouded his perspective on the life that he wanted to live. So that's first. Secondly, this is the period that we now know is a transition point from the late antiquity period to the medieval world, as I've already said. This is important because, as we'll see going forward through later lectures, but we want to point out now, this is the period of time in which the western half of the Roman Empire begins to crumble. In fact, just as Augustine lays dying in his bed in the year 430, the Vandals, the Aryan barbarian tribes, were literally besieging the city of Hippo where he lived. He died, in a manner of speaking, seeing the collapse of the Roman world around him. The importance of this is that Augustine is uniquely positioned, and he's very sensitive to discuss the issue of how Christians ought to live in a world where they have successes and failures, where certain politicians rise up and support the Christian church, and, at times, wolves take over the pasture land, and the church must sort of huddle itself up and be concerned with persecution that is on the rise. He is, in other words, one of the first to really experience some real serious anxiety after the rise of Constantine to the throne. Now, it hadn't been perfect after Constantine, obviously, but what Augustine is aware of is that the Roman world was not long for this world, and that there was something that was going to come after it. And therefore he is positioned and he is sensitive to the realities that the world is changing around him. Thirdly and lastly, it's too often overlooked as to where Augustine lives and where he writes in the context of the evolution of creedal orthodoxy in the church. Augustine's main activity in his life takes place, in terms of our previous lectures on the creeds, between the councils of Constantinople and of Ephesus I. In other words, Augustine is living in a world that has pretty much decided where its vocabulary is going to come from and what it's going to say about the Trinity. But during Augustine's days, a lot of this swirling discussion about the ability of humanity to save itself or to be sanctified is still swirling in Augustine's day. Pelagianism, in other words, and the fights that he has with it, are instrumentally involved in this evolution of the understanding of the incarnation and of the cross that will lead all the way down until the Council of Chalcedon. In fact, the Council of Chalcedon takes place within a generation of Augustine's death. And this third point is important because too often Augustine just kind of lifts right out of his context. We forget that he's part of the conversation that's evolving in the theological world. And this is frequently the case for great figures in history, whether it's the church's history or world history itself. Great figures get kind of put on the pedestal and we lose their context. But it's important to notice this because one of Augustine's greatest works, for example, was called On the Trinity. And it's a marvel because it, in very serious, eloquent, and creative language, demonstrates how much we can say and think about and reflect on the Trinity within the pretty generous parameters of Nicaea and Constantinople in terms of how we'll describe the Trinity. And I said in the lectures on the creeds that the councils are really more concerned with limiting our language. I said it's a bit like bumpers in the bowling alley. It hems us in from going too far in different directions. Well, what Augustine does is he manages to explore all of the breadth and the width and the depth within that creedal orthodoxy of the Trinity. And not everyone loves what he has to say about the Trinity, but it is important to realize that he shows and demonstrates a faithful, reflective, creative engagement with the Scriptures within the bounds and the confines of creedal confessionalism. But he's also living in the run-up to the Council of Chalcedon. And so he's going to spend a great deal of energy focusing on the nature of humanity, because that issue of the nature of humanity plays directly into Christology and who Christ is and what he came to do on our behalf. Augustine will say, as others said before him and after him, that if we are dead in our sins, then what Christ came to do was to be the perfect human sacrifice on our behalf. But, and Augustine is very perceptive on this with the Pelagians, if Christ came merely to give us some extra strength for our own moral sanctity, then the aftermath of that in terms of the Christian life is profound. Well, let's carry on and look at Augustine's life in his context and his conversion. Now, there are two sources for this, and they are profoundly detailed. I've already mentioned the Confessions. The Confessions are written by Augustine himself, and they are his autobiography. They are profoundly detailed. In fact, historians to this day can trace a number of specific details as he evolves and moves to Rome and then Milan and then back. He gives so much detail and color that we're actually able to write a pretty significantly full biography from his Confessions with other research and archaeology and things going on around it. The Confessions actually cover the ages of birth to the age of 35 for Augustine. It carries up to his conversion at the age of 31, and then it carries on for 3 or 4 years after, roughly until the time when he becomes a pastor and then a bishop. Now, it needs to be stressed here, Augustine writes this confession at a middle age. He's 47 when he writes this. He's a bishop, and he has been a bishop for some years. So the confession is not merely a journal or a point-by-point calendar of everything that's going on in his life. It's more like a spiritual meditation or a theological interpretation of his own life. But thankfully, he was such a good writer and such a good mind that he gives us so much rich history along the way. Carrying on after the period of time for the Confessions, we actually have another very good text from Posidonius. And Posidonius was a friend of Augustine's, and he was a fellow bishop in a nearby city. And he wrote, not long after Augustine died, another life of the remainder of Augustine's life. And again, he gave us so much information and so much detail that compared to just about anyone else in the first 4 or 5 centuries of the church, we have more material on Augustine's life than we do on just about anyone else. Well, Augustine's life begins in the city of Tagaste. He was born to a pagan father, more of an indifferent father, really, to religion, not an overt pagan believer in rituals or these kinds of things, but a pagan in the sense of being non-Christian. His father was named Patricius, or Patrick, as some people tend to anglicize it. His mother was Monica. Now, Monica is a firebrand. She's awesome. Monica goes down as one of the great mothers of the church. In fact, I always say she's the first great helicopter mom to ever exist. Monica almost literally chases her son down for Jesus. She prays for him. She chases him. She's not perfect herself by any means. She makes at least one unwise decision by pressing Augustine to try to have a noble marriage. One of the things that actually causes his tailspin, actually, that leads to his conversion, is this moment when his mother tries to get him to leave his concubine and marry. So she's not perfect, but she's a wonderful mother. And I think lots of people can sympathize, whether as a mother or as a parent, with seeing the pride and joy of your life, the person that you give so much for, run off and chase the worst things possible for his soul and for his well-being. And what's more, even in the midst of his success, seeing him without contentment. She chases him, in a manner of speaking. She moves to be near him from time to time. And in a very poignant moment, 2 years after Augustine is converted, and a year after he's baptized, Monica passes away, knowing full well that her son has embraced the faith that she prayed for all of her life. Well, the area of Tagaste is in the modern country of Algeria. And again, we've already noticed that this is a bit of the Bible Belt. This is the kind of tough, really muscular Christianity. Not everyone is Christian, but those who are Christian take it deadly seriously. There is another movement afoot, though, in Africa, as well as in other parts of the Roman world, and that is the ideas of Manichaeanism. Now, it used to be believed that Manichaeanism was some kind of offshoot version of Christianity. We now know that it wasn't. It really was a syncretistic religion. The reason why I was confused for so long as being pseudo-Christian was that Manichaeanism ripped so much from the Christian faith into its own self-identity that at times it looked as if it was sort of quasi-Christian, sort of an alternative version of Christianity. Well, Manichaeanism is, I tell students, a bit like communist or socialistic thought from, say, the 1920s until the 1970s. During the times of the world wars, and especially during the Cold War, communism or socialism, certain ideas associated with these worldviews became kind of fashionable, particularly, I always say, with college freshmen. They leave their home, they go on, and they adopt the radical thing that will just hack their parents off if they only knew that they were embracing these ideas and not the good democratic ideals of their parents. Manichaeanism really functions this way in North Africa in particular, and we'll pick up more on that in just a minute. Well, Augustine is sent off as a young man to learn his Latin, to really engage in the intellectual pursuits of learning how to read and write. And it's during this time in the Confessions that Augustine reflects on the kind of tortured youth that he felt that he had. Augustine describes the scene of stealing some pears with some friends, that these rebellious youths had done sort of a 5-finger discount on food from someone's orchard. And Augustine really kind of goes to great pains to say that he was so sinful at this, the gleefulness with which he pursued this kind of rebellion culminated in the fact that he wasn't even hungry. He just threw the pears away after he stole them. Well, what's going on here? Well, some people, particularly moderns in the Western world, like to blame Augustine for a guilt complex that they allege that Augustine gave to us. Now, I can say that it's empirical that so many other cultures in the world, not simply Western post-Augustinian world, experience significant amounts of guilt. So this idea that only Augustine gave us guilt in the West is itself sort of a crazy genealogy of ideas. But let's actually focus on the story, because a lot of people point to this and they say, what a crazy thing to say in a book, in an autobiography, this sort of lament that you stole some pears. I think it might, by the way, say as much about us that we think, oh, kids. But two things. One, in Augustine's day, stealing of this kind was actually a more serious infraction than it would be in our own world today. But more importantly, what is Augustine doing here? Again, apply the hermeneutic. 47-year-old bishop, a man who has slogged it out with Pelagians on the issue of original sin. That is, the question of whether or not we were born in sin and evil or not. Here, in a very interesting way, Augustine almost, and people have noticed this for years, Augustine almost recreates the garden scene of sin. People notice that he is describing in great detail the fruit, the forbidden fruit. And then he is going to some great extent to say, here I am as a boy, and just like Adam and Eve, and just like that impulse that they had after they fell, the narcissism, the sort of hunger to feed oneself whatever you want at any point, sort of lusts and passions out of whack. Augustine is saying here, frankly, already at a young boy, here I am sinning. And he's just sort of marveling at how much the sin and the rebellion of his life was present even at a young age. Now, if you read the Confessions, the pear tree incident is not the only place he does this. In fact, he describes himself at the age of 1 day, a newborn, as a sinner, a little infant in sin. In other words, he is weaving in very complex and important topics of theology that he has discussed in a more philosophical manner. In a somewhat pastoral, sermonic sense, he is taking this and he's showing, look, even I have this. Original sin, this doctrine of sin that we have, it's not just abstract, it shows up in each of our lives. And he confesses these sins. And in particular, he talks about this pear tree incident where he stole some things simply for the joy and the thrill of it. Well, Augustine tells us that he was a relatively lazy student up until about the age of 17 or 18. And it's at this point that he goes on to the city of Carthage, where he studies the subject of rhetoric. Now, rhetoric needs some explaining. There really is no subject, no single subject in the modern world, and in particular in the English-speaking world, that can compare to rhetoric in terms of its privileged status in Rome. For Romans, Christian or pagan, the supreme intellectual discipline, the one that beat them all, was rhetoric. Now that's very strange for the modern ear, because in our modern world, something that is rhetorical is fake. It's false words. It's just simply eloquence without substance. But in Augustine's day, the subject of rhetoric was by far the most important topic. This idea of learned eloquence and persuasion was considered to be a subject that only a few could master, and of those who mastered it, only a few were at the very top of the ladder in terms of their importance and their skill in this trade. So Augustine is going on to Carthage. He goes to the city of Carthage at the age of 17 or 18 to study rhetoric. He has a bright future in front of him, in other words. And it's there at Carthage that Augustine actually converts to the doctrines of Manichaeism. Now, Manichaeism gave Augustine two things. First of all, Manichaeism was a really harsh dualism. It believed in this real harsh distinction between the good or the light and the evil and the bad of this world. And people have noticed that Manichaeism, for a time, gave Augustine some answer to the question of, why do I feel so conflicted? Why can't I be happy? Why can't I be truly happy? The more important thing with Manichaeism that stuck with Augustine all the way until his conversion is Manichaeism liked to poke fun at Christianity for its inability to interpret the Bible literally. Those Manichaeans who self-identified as Christian, or at least mostly Christian, were something like radical literalists. In North Africa and other places, this radical literalism forced a number of Manichaeans to actually cut out large portions of the Old Testament in particular, as well as some in the New. For them, you have to translate the Bible literally. And so places where they see that Yahweh is described as having an arm or having a face, they chuckled at this. They thought this was bumpkin theology. How could you describe God with metaphor? This is crazy. If it says he has an arm and a face and a voice, well, then you must be literal. No allegorical or figurative translations here, please. And so their theology and their philosophy, as well as their interpretation of the scriptures, cause them to chunk out all kinds of things. Now that hangs with Augustine for some time, because there's an instinct in him all the way until he meets Ambrose, where he simply can't understand how you interpret some of these texts in the scripture literally. Augustine, from his Manichaean days, carries with him this concern that we need a very clear rationale as to when we're going to be literal, in the sense of when do we see it as actual history that happened, and when do we see things as extended metaphors, or when do we notice metaphorical language. But Augustine feels this problem. He gets this from Manichaeism, this concern for literal exegesis. Well, one more thing from his early days that we'll cover, because it carries on for the rest of his life, and that is, while he's at Carthage, he tells us that he lives a real kind of free sexual lifestyle. Well, finally, at the age of 19, he takes a concubine. Now be careful, concubine here does not mean prostitute or some kind of sex slave. Concubine is another word for common law wife, you might say. It's somebody with whom you share just about everything you would someone who you were married to. But given the rules of the day in the Roman world, to have a concubine meant that there were no fiscal or property obligations should one of you die. There was no sort of bringing together of the assets and of the entirety of your life. It was simply marriage in terms of love, sex, and relationship together. Now it's telling here because Augustine, in the Confessions, never gives the name of the concubine. We simply don't know her name. Whether this is from guilt, whether this is to spare her family, which is probably unlikely, or whether this is just simply Augustine not wanting to give us the details, who knows? But he never gives us the name of this woman, though he did spend years with her. And he confesses that he loved her. They had one son together, Adeodatus. And Adeodatus is with Augustine all the way through the rest of his life. It actually is baptized with his dad a year after Augustine converts under the preaching of Ambrose, and he dies a short time thereafter. Now, to kind of sum up Augustine's early life, I think if we just focus on the person of Adeodatus, there's a vital clue here as to what Augustine is experiencing spiritually. Because the name Adeodatus means, literally, given by God. Datus is a Latin word for giving or gift. A is an ablative form, it means by. And then Deo is right there in the middle. Deo is the root word of where we get the word Deus, which is something you might recognize from even modern usage of the word Deus to mean God. So the name literally means by God given, or a gift of God, or the child given to me by God. Well, that is compelling because, again, Augustine is this tortured soul. He has a Christian mom who won't leave him alone, who has preached and done hellfire and brimstone sermons for him about the dangers of sex and carnal living. His backdrop, the world he grew up in, was predominantly Christian, at least in the experience that he had. But it also had these unsavory elements that he was attracted to, that he was drawn to from his sinful nature. But I find it compelling that when he has a son, and those of you who have children will know, when you have your first one, it's not all pretty, it's not all a Hallmark card having children, but that wonderful moment of holding your child and now viscerally understanding the scriptural passages that say God is your father and he cares for you like a little child is really hard to put into words. And here, when Augustine has a son, he actually chooses a relatively spiritual name, the one given by God, the child that God gave me. I think it speaks to something like a prodigal, conflicted, tortured soul in Augustine that is not entirely pagan. There are claws in him, put there by Monica probably, and certainly by the world that he grew up in, where he cannot convince himself, intellectually and morally, that Christianity has anything to offer. But yet there is this instinct in the important moments of life to still mention God somewhat. This pagan man, this man with the concubine, this man that's run off and has nothing to do with the Christian faith, that's pursuing a glorified career in the art of rhetoric, has a son and names him Adeodatus. Well, how does he convert? In 375, after his education was done, Augustine sort of sets up a shop. You might say he hangs a shingle, and he teaches rhetoric in the city of Carthage. And he's there for 8 or 9 years, and then he decides to try his hand at a big city, a more prestigious city. Now, given that we know that Augustine self-identifies as an African, for him to move to the city of Rome as he does is telling. He's chasing the bright lights. And he moves to Rome, and again, he opens up a school of rhetoric, sort of a life of tutoring students in the subject of rhetoric. Now, he doesn't like it while he's there. There's just parts of the city and parts of the culture there that don't really fit with what he wanted or what he expected. Well, suddenly he has a chance meeting with a man by the name of Symmachus. Symmachus was prefect of Rome, which means he was essentially the governor, the ruler of that city. And Symmachus tells Augustine that the imperial court in Milan has put out a request for someone to identify someone who can come to this major city of Milan to become a professor of rhetoric. This job, this professorship of rhetoric, is set up, frankly, to be one of the most important and the most prestigious platforms from which anyone who is a student or a teacher of rhetoric can hold. And it's telling that Augustine wins this post. He becomes professor of rhetoric in Milan, the imperial city. Now again, notice, Milan is an important city. It is where the imperial court is. And since so much of the rhetorical discipline is giving speeches on behalf of politicians and being involved in politics, to hold the professorship of Milan essentially holds the highest chair of rhetoric in the most important city in the West in terms of politics. He has, you might say, reached the top. And he's done so in 384 at only the age of 30. The big jerk. At the age of 30, he's reached the highest point of his professional career. Well, the doubts don't stop. Augustine still feels this pressure, this push, to find something that's missing. While he had been in Rome, Augustine had finally abandoned his Manichaeanism, and he had for a time developed Neoplatonic ideas. Now, we discussed Platonism in a previous lecture, but let's look at Neoplatonism for 2 seconds. In essence, moving from Manichaeanism to Neoplatonism meant that Augustine moved from this harsh pessimism, this dualism, to this kind of more mystical, optimistic intellectualism of Neoplatonism. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't really seem to work. Platonism sort of becomes a midwife to people who are vagabonds intellectually, trying on Platonism, liking it, finding it ultimately unsatisfactory, and then at a pregnant moment, someone drops in the seeds of the gospel, and they find that Platonism was somehow pointing them to the ultimate expression of truth and biblical fidelity, which is the gospel. Well, this is really what happens with Augustine. When he gets to the city of Milan, this is really interesting. He hears that actually there is an intellectual man, a Christian man, and he hears of the extraordinary rhetorical power of the preaching of Ambrose, and he's drawn to it. Augustine actually decides that he's going to go listen to Ambrose, not out of a sort of curious desire to learn more about the biblical faith. He actually goes expecting to really not listen much to the theology at all, but rather to pay attention to the staggering rhetoric and the wonderful eloquence of this preacher. And Augustine goes, and he is pretty dumbfounded. He's awestruck by Ambrose. Now that tells us something again. If the man who's holding the professorship of rhetoric at one of the highest posts in the Western world goes and hears Ambrose preach and he himself is impressed, that should tell us something about where Ambrose ranks in terms of his rhetoric, in terms of his prowess as a preacher. Well, people sometimes believe that Ambrose kind of preached Augustine into the kingdom, and he does in a manner of speaking. But Augustine actually, in his own words, describes Ambrose's relationship with him and the impact he has on him a bit differently. He describes Ambrose as a friendly man, and he describes this great love, this kind of magnanimous personality, this great lover of people. In other words, he's a pastor. He's not just a pulpiteer. Ambrose is a real pastor. And Augustine says that it was the love of the man that sort of became another father to him, that led him eventually to listen more and more to this gospel. Well, finally, in the summer of 386, at the age of 31, Augustine converts. And the story of his conversion is relatively famous. He was in the garden reading one day, and he has read some stuff on the life of St. Anthony, the great desert monk who we looked at in our lecture on monasticism. And Augustine is really struck to the heart by this. he tells us that he actually is weeping, that these conflicts, this doubt within him, this inability to live a good life despite all of the success that he has left him empty, and he is weeping. And he tells us that he hears a child's voice. Maybe it was only in his mind, maybe it was a child over the wall. There's been some debate on that over the years. But the child's voice says, tola lege, which in Latin means, pick it up and read it. It's a command form in the Latin grammar. Pick it up, read it. And like not a few Christians over the years, Augustine picks up the Bible, he flips it open, he puts his finger down on a verse, and he reads it. And the verse he lands on is Romans 13:13, which is the great chapter of the transformation of the Christian having been empowered by the Spirit, in which it describes that Christians do not live in drunkenness and orgies and the sins of the flesh, that something about the empowerment of the Spirit comes into them, and now that they are loved by the gospel, these things no longer have power over them. And Augustine converts. Now, I want to unpack this just for 2 seconds because it's important to get it. A lot of people, when they read Romans 13:13, and they see that Augustine converts reading a passage that really, if taken out of context, sounds a great deal like legalism, it doesn't seem to square with the fact that Augustine is the doctor of grace. He's the man who really put grace back on the map in terms of the Western world in describing our sin and our need for a free gospel. Well, there's 3 clues in this story that I think are important to notice. 1, he already seems to be depressed. He's not really at the height of his power. He's not bragging at this point. And the reason we know this is that he's reading the story of a desert father, a monk. Now, anybody who's just a rank-and-file pagan is not reading that kind of a text. It is a staggeringly important Christian text about the Christian life. He's looking for something, and he seems to be looking in the Christian faith of his mother and of his past from North Africa. The second thing, and it's a bit fuzzy and murky, we simply don't know, but I have always questioned, why does he have a Bible sitting there? Forget about the child's voice, whether or not it was actually a child over the wall or in his head. The fact that he has a Bible near at hand and he flips it open. I have not seen enough people notice that. It just simply is the case he goes, oh, let me get the Bible that's laying right next to me. He seems to have been reading the thing. He's processing something. There's something going on in his psyche here. And I think it's very important. He's not just any old pagan. Romans 13:13 is not the first verse he ever reads. Rather, it seems to be the case that when he opens into that passage, there is something that clicks, something he's been longing for, some hope for change that he's never been able to do it on his own strength or with the philosophies of the pagan world. And here he finds in the Bible that there is something, some hope of change that he can grasp hold of. And so he converts. A year later, 387, he is baptized by his new spiritual father, Ambrose. In 388, Monica dies, again, having seen her son come to the faith. And then he moves back to North Africa, and several years later, in 391, he is finally ordained as a priest, and then several years after that, a bishop. And it is in that context, in that life as a bishop, as a leading theologian and a leader of the church, that Augustine writes some of the most important theology of the Western world on some of the most important topics in all of the Christian life. And it's those topics and his writings about those topics that we'll look at in our next lecture.